Hello and welcome back to this damnful idealistic crusade. This is the next in my series of doing comparison rereads back to back of both the original and revised text of the classic Hardy Boys series. So this is a video on book 17, The Secret Warning. The original text is from 1938, written by John Button, and the first book's not to be written by primary series writer Leslie MacFarlane, who had written the first 16 of the series originally. And then the revised text was from 1966, written by James Lawrence, who had done a number of Hardy Boys text around that time period. While it's one of the books that's labeled as being completely different, it does have the same sort of core story elements, and in particular, that's with deep sea diving and salvage in terms of salvaging a wreck tied into the case and nefarious goings on both underwater and around said deep sea salvage operation. But the actual getting to that point and any subplots are entirely different. So as I've discussed in the past videos, even when it's a book like this that is technically completely different, there's enough of the same core elements and a lot of names are reused and certain locations just in a different way that you really can't say that they're completely different books. There's enough sort of the DNA of the original text in the revised text to understand that it is definitely a revised text. But you're only going to get this stuff if you read them back to back. If you read them separately, you're not going to pick up on all the little small things such as character names being reused. A brief note for anyone who's not aware of the revised text process or has not seen my previous videos, the original Hardy Boys books, of course, started in 1927, but starting in 1959, the Stratemeyer Syndicate behind them decided they wanted to try and modernize the previous books to be up to date with the times and remove any slight elements of cultural stereotyping and other dated references that very much ties them to the time in which they were written, the 20s, 30s, 40s. But also, this was a means of streamlining the books and getting them to a shorter page count, and eventually they did away with the hardcovers with dust jacket and switched to the much easier to print iconic picture cover format. So it was also a means of some have called it literary vandalism, but it is very much a means of slimming the books down and getting the cost down and also making them more uniform with the books that were being written at the time. So that means the first 38 books of the Hardy Boys series exist in two forms, and the original texts were never reprinted again until the first couple books started entering the public domain in the past couple years, and so far only the first 6 have. So you can now easily get your hands on various versions of the original text of the first 6 books, but that means books 7 through 38 you have to track down vintage editions, and you also have to compare them to the other revised texts. Usually the revisions can vary wildly. Sometimes it's just some slight updating in terms of location and time period. So usually the later books are the slight ones like that. Some are drastic reworking, some introduce new subplots, some make the original plot the subplot of the new version, and some are completely different books, and the only thing they share is the title and the ghostwriter credit always being Franklin W. Dixon. But as I just mentioned with this book, even when it's an example where the book is completely different, usually in my experience there's enough of the core elements of the original to at least recognize echoes of it, but that's only if you read the books back to back. But in the most extreme case, they literally just rewrote the book and stuck the same title on. So in terms of discussing the two texts, let's go ahead and get it out of the way. So far, this is definitely the first video where I can say without question, it is no contest which book is better. The revised text is an actual Hardy Boys book. It has a consistent plot. It makes sense. It's engaging. It has memorable moments. The original text, as I mentioned, was written by John Button, and his books are the most atypical. They feel out of place. The tone is not only inconsistent, but jarring, I think, with the rest of the series. And they're very much an acquired taste. This first one is the tamest of the three because his next two books kind of go way off the charts in terms of the crazy factor scale. Which you prefer, or if you enjoy any of them, will be up to you. But John Button books are often regarded in the Hardy Boys fan community or fan discussions as the sort of black sheep of the original text. They do really stick out, and even though they were still coming from Stratemeyer Syndicate outlines, especially if you're reading the books consecutively in chronological release order, it's a jarring shift between the first 16 Leslie MacFarlane books and then coming here to Secret Warning. In particular, Frank and Joe Hardy, the boys themselves, don't quite act like themselves all the time, and the actual mystery as such is almost on the back burner. The book seems very incidental. Essentially, the Hardy Boys themselves have a run-in with a pair of nefarious characters. They almost have a slight run-in out on the bay in their boats, and then for the rest of the book, the boys are essentially pursued by these two criminals who try to kill them or get them arrested by the police under false pretenses for seemingly the most mundane of reasons. They're determined to get revenge, and this happens continually. And then it just so happens that they're tied into the overall main villainy going on with a more cut-rate, nefarious salvage operation. The actual mystery and the actual plot seems almost an afterthought. The book is very much episodic, and the one thing it does have, like a lot of the original text, there's obviously a sense of it being very pulpy, like the pulp fiction of pulp magazines of the era in the 1930s especially, and the boys are in constant peril. I mean, there is very much the real standout moments are the action sequences, especially the underwater sequences where the boys are in old-fashioned diving equipment with the big metal helmets attached to an air tube, and those sequences are the most memorable. The book is so scattershot and all over the place that really all I ever remember from it, and I think most people will feel the same way, all you really remember from it are the action and near-death sequences, particularly the underwater ones, dealing with older technology and being deep-sea diving in the 1930s. But that also gets back to the book's absolutely inconsistent, if probably more non-existent logic, because here you have teenage boys with no diving experience just being told, oh, you want to go deep-sea diving to a wrecked ship? Okay, here you go. And then, of course, they almost die like every time they go down. So then they go down more. So reckless endangerment. Great, guys. That's just an example. Another would be how their father, world-renowned famous private investigator Fenton Hardy, apparently kept some really important papers for a case he's working on in his suit jacket pocket in the closet. And when the boys have a visitor over, who, of course, gets tied into the plot later because they have to go find him and spend quite a long time doing so, they give him a coat because his clothes are ruined. And of course, no one knows that their father, one of the most famous private investigators in the world, instead of putting these important papers in his safe like you would, or at least somewhere in, where they're in a safe place, if they're so vital to your case, they're left in the coat pocket. And then, like, the next day they get a telegram saying, hey, I need these papers. I left them in my coat pocket. And they're like, oh no. So then the next section of the book is the boys trying to find their acquaintance again, and they can't find him. And then on the way to trying to find him just to get some papers back that were left in a coat pocket, they're followed by this pair of nefarious criminals who, again, they had a slight run-in with in the bay in their boat. And then these guys try to kill them multiple times and get them arrested at one point. And then when the boys finally manage to track down their acquaintance, then they have to go find the papers, and then they figure out it went to the dry cleaners, but then the dry cleaners is burned to the ground and on fire. And so as the boys do throughout this book, displaying not really any logic, Joe Hardy charges into the flames and almost gets himself killed and doesn't get anywhere. And then we find that the boys' acquaintances just happens to be a deep-sea diver himself, and the boys then spend the rest of the book, along with their pal Chet Morton, basically going on deep-sea dives and living on the salvage operation, and also helping them deal with a nefarious crew of competitors who don't necessarily play by the rules. And among those just happened to be the nefarious pair that had been stalking and trying to kill the boys all this time. So to say it's an inconsistent book is an understatement, because I find it difficult to even give a plot summary. I've read this book several times over the years. It was definitely a shock reading it the first time because I didn't know what was going on, and the book does not make sense. It just goes from one event to another, and it's also quite repetitive, and great stretches of the book are essentially the boys kind of going in circles and just going from one near-death experience to the other. There's no real sense of logic, and the secret warning of the title, eventually you realize you could take it to mean one of several notes the boys are left, particularly one, actually more than one, that are left in their hotel room, just a little cryptic message basically saying stay away or leave this case alone. So even the secret warning of the title isn't anything all that special or anything. So all the original text has really is the sense of wildness. Again, the best sequences are the deep sea diving sequences where you have teenage boys with no diving experience. They clearly admit this, going down to the depths without modern scuba equipment, attached to an old air hose that can get hooked or caught at any point, in the old style diving suits, trying to not get the bends, having to use decompression chambers, almost dying, getting caught and stuck in old shipwrecks. Because it's older technology, it's a book written in the 30s, and the author, John Button, being really good at describing those sequences, those are gripping. You can very much picture in your mind's eye those sequences, and they're exceptionally well done. Those are the best moments of the book. The rest of it it's just weird. It's also, strangely, as wild and as 1930s two-fisted pulpy as it can get, it's also a little bit bland in a way, because again, when I sit down to think about trying to recount do a plot summary, I can't do it. I can only remember certain moments and how I'm left scratching my head, and it's not helped by the fact that clearly the author doesn't have a handle on Frank and Joe Hardy as characters and Chet Morton and the other chums, and it just feels a bit alien to the first 16 books. You could definitely, even if you didn't know it was a different writer, I think you'd be able to tell it was a different writer. Because the tone is so inconsistent and not in keeping with the first 16 books, except for the best action moments and where there's a little bit of humor that's also getting at the sort of grittier slice of life element that you have in the original text. So for me, the original text of The Secret Warning it's kind of all over the place. And while it has some of the strengths of the original text in terms of that pulpy action, adventure, sense of peril, that sort of wild flavor, and that wild sense is cranked up to its highest in these John Button books, it is definitely the weakest of the first 17 by far. It doesn't hold a candle to the first 16 written by Leslie MacFarlane, and I think anybody reading the series, the original text, for the first time will get that right off the bat. But again, there's some inventive moments, and those action sequences are great, but it's just it's not really the most enjoyable of reads, because you're going to be sitting there scratching your head a lot of the time. In terms of what might have been found objectionable, in terms of what would have been looked at in the revision text, the one thing that does stand out to me the most, the only sort of thing where you're obviously going to go, okay, yeah, that definitely is not something you'd do after this point in terms of literature or writing or any sort of mass media. At one point, the boys are trying to not be spotted aboard the salvage ship by the other crew of the nefarious ones. So essentially, they disguise themselves as ship workers or just whatever sort of costume they can come up with or something. But they all take a different approach, and this is a very small section, so it's almost blink and you miss it because it's not really gone into. But Joe Hardy does disguise himself essentially with shoe polish in blackface, and that is something you're going to see throughout media, especially of the early 20th century. But that's the only thing I noticed that was something that obviously would have been changed for the revised text. And it's such a short, little, brief mention that every time I come to that section, I have to stop and remind myself, oh yeah, they're actually doing that, because the actual writing, the actual book itself, is not engaging you enough to even notice a cringy detail like that. And again, even that little sequence, it takes you a second to realize what the plot is actually doing, because you're not engaging with the book because it's so inconsistent. You're just trying to get from chapter to chapter and get to the next sort of set piece of the boys almost dying again, or getting killed or arrested, or dying in the unknown terrors of the deep or something. So it's so episodic and so inconsistent that, again, it's hard to even process what's going on. And basically, if you're looking at anything that's not the sort of opening chapters of setup, and anything that's not the deep sea diving sequences, the rest of the book feels definitely repetitive. There's a lot of backtracking and circular action, and a lot of repeat actions, but it just, there's no consistency. There's nothing that grab onto. The plot that emerges is okay, but it seems almost coincidental, and this is just not really an enjoyable read. It's got some of the crazier, over the top action elements, but it's also got all of the feeling alien to the rest of the series, and the boys not really behaving like themselves. But it also doesn't really do anything too crazy outside of that. So it's definitely going to have some stuff that'll rub you the wrong way, or you might be able to read it and enjoy it enough. For me, The Twisted Claw, which is book 18, is probably the best of the John Button books, because the sort of over-the-top craziness is actually more blended into the story, and that one has that fun pulp energy to it that gets maintained. It's consistent. Book 19, The Disappearing Floor, is where you go into complete crazy territory, because there's science fiction gadgetry, a crazy old inventor. The boys really don't seem like themselves. It doesn't read or feel like a Hardy Boys book, and that book is generally regarded as the worst in the original text canon, for good reason, because it's the most off-the-wall and out there, and it's like the editor at the Stratemeyer Syndicate took a vacation and nobody checked it, and they just rubber stamped it and said okay. But even with that said, I wouldn't call any of the John Button books bad. They're just the sort of lowest level of the original text. They're the outliers. They stick out the most. And Secret Warning, I think, sets you up for what's to come in the other books that he would write consecutively. So 17, 18, 19 are very much the sort of weird transitional, we don't know what we're doing era of the original text, and it's the first not written by the same author who had started the series and wrote books 1 through 16. So that makes the sort of transitional 3 books even more jarring. Things kind of start to get back on track more, and MacFarlane came back for a few more books. So it's interesting to study the books at this point, and any series will have a point like this. But with the Hardy Boys, you run into it with the John Button books, starting here in Secret Warning. So James Lawrence wrote the 1966 revised text. You do have the boys involved in deep sea salvage operations. The name of the shipwreck is the Katawa, so that remains. And we have various other names, such as the names of the 2 criminals in the original text. They're here, so you can recognize certain elements, and there's enough of the plot elements in the DNA of the original text to see how the revised text is directly connected to it. But basically, they fixed every problem from the original text. The plot is not only consistent, but we also have the introduction of the subplots that Fenton Hardy is also investigating the sinking of the Katawa, because on board there was a fabulous treasure of a golden pharaoh's head that now the insurance company is involved in perhaps doing a payout, and it seems very likely that there was some unknown third party Hardy, perhaps trying to defraud the insurance company or steal the Pharaoh's head and sink the ship for other reasons. So there's multiple different aspects to how the Hardys' case themselves and their plot and their father's case intersect. So it's more than just one sort of case line. But also we have a location of Whalebone Island, which the boys do get to explore multiple times, and a backstory there with the lighthouse and the lighthouse keeper that was eventually driven insane, ostensibly by the ghost spirit of a red-bearded pirate who actually appears at the opening of the book outside the boys' house. So there's a sort of perhaps a supernatural element that permeates throughout the book. But having that, the addition of the subplot of the Golden Pharaoh's head, a better tie-in to Fenton Hardy's case, who actually makes appearances in the book, the location of Whalebone Island, the boys and Chet Morton getting to investigate there and spend extended periods of time there, getting more details and better integration of the salvage company into the main plots and the competing, more cut-rate nefarious salvage company, that all fits in perfectly. And because the book is shorter, it's more focused and more concise. And what amazes me in doing these comparisons is how the revised texts were able to do all of this, have more characters, entire new subplots, so much more material crammed in and better laid out in examples like this with a significantly shorter page count is nothing short of miraculous. So essentially what people did in terms of the editors and James Lawrence doing the writing, they went in and basically, I think, surgically took apart the original text and kept the sort of basic concept of the deep sea salvage team investigating wrecked ships and transposed that to an actual legitimate location and used the island and the elements of the old lighthouse and the pirate ghost and the sort of backstory that's hinted at, which also does eventually involve a World War II connection and German U-boats. And already this sounds more invested and entertaining than the original text, just me naming off some of the plot beats and elements. But the revised text is so much more consistent that I don't think anybody could say that they preferred the original text unless you're really big on those pulpier elements and you put that above anything else. That's the only way I think I could see somebody saying they really preferred the John Button 1938 original text, because every issue I have with the original text is not a problem in the revised text. It reads so much better. The characters are on point. The mysteries are much more engaging and actually conclusive. And after the final wrap-up, everything makes sense. It's a much more satisfying book. And we also have a greater sense of character dynamics and relationships, and the actual building of the acts is actually readable in terms of you could actually understand the act structure and the unraveling of the mysteries and how the multiple mysteries come together at the end, as they do in virtually every Hardy Boys book. So essentially, across the board, the revised text is the better experience. The original text has the pulp grittiness and the wildness, but it's not a fair contest. It really isn't. I knew when I got to the John Button books, it would be pretty much like this, but rereading these back to back really underlined that even more, because I remembered I thought the original text of Secret Warning was inconsistent and a disappointment, but rereading it and then immediately reading the revised text that I grew up with just highlighted all of that. I think this is a fascinating back-to-back comparison read for people to do, because it shows completely different approaches with a lot of the same story elements, and shows the strengths of the revision process, I think, better than any other examples. So if you look at the revised texts of the original books written by John Button, this is where you're going to see the revised texts at their strongest, because if they wanted to make sure the original texts were on point with the text of the 1950s, and the Hardy Boys themselves are on point with their characterizations, how they're supposed to be, these are the books that they needed to do. Even the secret warning of the title is given a legitimate, striking moment in the revised text. It's what's depicted on the Rudy Nappy final cover, and it is indeed the abandoned lighthouse being hooked up with a red light, flashing a secret signal in Morse code, which the boys actually decode as they're racing along the slough at night and realize it's actually talking about them. So that has a really nice ominous quality to it, and it gives a really dramatic moment to the title. So the secret warning is given a legitimately title-worthy secret warning moment in the book. So even the title moment of the book in the revised text wipes the floor with the whichever moment you want to choose in the original text, because there were multiple secret warnings that are very generic in the original text. But yeah, this one's no contest. I enjoyed being able to compare them directly, but it really will highlight extremely strongly how the John Button books are just not the best example of the original text. Let's put it that way. I knew when I got to this point it would kind of be like this, and these would be interesting to talk about. But I think most fans sort of agree the original texts of 17, 18, 19 are very much an acquired taste, and some are weirder certainly than others. So in the next two videos on 18 and 19, I'll have even more to discuss. But basically, the original text of Secret Warning is only setting the stage for the over-the-topness to come in the original text of 18 and 19. But without question, the James Lawrence revised text of The Secret Warning is the better of the two. There is simply no contest. Now let's talk about the cover artwork designs, as I like to do in these videos. The original for the 1938 release, used on editions up until the second cover artwork, is by Paul Launey, who did a number of Hardy Boys covers around this time period. So this one is also seeing the book designed to be in a sort of transitional phase. If you look at books 16, 17, 18, 19, they're trying a couple different things with the logos and the fonts used, and also the approach and the color and the sort of design layout. Here on Secret Warning, this is very much going for that sort of 1930s pulp magazine type feel. So in that sense, it's like the original covers for While the Clock Ticked, but not as extreme. You have the figure breaking into the boys' hotel room, and the boys being essentially awakened at night in their pajamas. This will get reused for the second cover, but here we have a nice bit of color in terms of the background, having a sort of yellow, orange, and almost purple look, which is eye-catching, and the criminal figures in a dark trench coat and a fedora and looking nefarious. So it's a good cover. It befits its time period, but I think I'm taking it this is supposed to be Frank Hardy in the background. It may be Joe. I'm not sure, but the actual detail of the face seems a bit iffy. That's the one thing that's always kind of bothered me about this cover. But I like that there's a sense of drama in that the criminal's caught in mid-act trying to go escape out the window, and we see somebody else has been sort of KO'd down on the ground. So there's enough drama in this cover, and it has a good dose of color to it, so it's eye-catching, and it does fit the original text, because we have actually a few sort of events kind of like this, but it's again seeing the cover art design at a sort of transitional period. Next is the 1962 updated cover by John Leone, who has a much more realistic style, again depicting pretty much one of the same events, where the boys' room gets broken into and somebody's being nefarious or leaving a warning note. Here, again, he's caught in the act. It's at night, and we have a nice night light sort of coming in from the open window, and he's actually halfway through the window as Joe Hardy's waking up, and we see the actual note where you can see it in detail. So there's a nice feeling of ominousness, but as with a lot of the late 50s, early 60s covers, there is a sort of plainness to the image, and the actual color of the bedding and the depiction of the boys is a bit, it's a bit plain looking, but the detail is nice, and I like that it's somebody in the act of some nefarious activity. So it's basically recreating the original cover moment, but in much greater, more realistic detail, which I like. But again, it's the sort of background being quite bare and the layout otherwise being rather generic and flat looking, it's kind of a toss up between, I don't know which I prefer between the first and second cover. This one, I like the criminal escaping out of the night window. I like that section. That's what your eye is drawn to. But the rest of it is just kind of flat. And so you don't even really, your eye just sort of scans over that. And then the placement of the title is a bit offset too. So it unfortunately has the appearance of being a little bit plain. So I think the original cover having that sort of pulpy feel and color probably elevates it over this second cover. Then we have the 1966 Rudy Nappy cover for the revised text, depicting, as I've said before, the actual secret warning moment of the title, with the boys along with Chet Morton in the iconic sleuth motorboat racing along the side of Whalebone Island, seeing the abandoned lighthouse suddenly light up in bright red light, flashing this warning message. The actual detail is great. The composition is nice. We have a sense of movement. We see the water spray coming up on the side of the ship. The lighthouse and the light is actually elevated, so obviously the boys are looking over at the lighthouse as they pass by, and this happening at night, and even getting the detail of the crescent moon in the background. It's a wonderfully evocative image of this same moment from the book. It is perfectly done. On the surface, though, due to the way the figures in the motorboat are smaller and the lighthouse is in the distance, it's not quite as eye-catching as some of the other covers in the series, but it is a perfect rendering of this moment from the book, the title moment, and the actual color usage is great. And depending on the printing you have, if you have a really good condition older copy, it's usually quite bold. So the actual dark blues of the water, the white of the boat, the color of the boys' shirts, and the red of the lighthouse glow usually pops out of the cover much more. So this is definitely one of Rudy Nappy's covers that I think is outstanding, but also much more on the subtle side. That it's not bad for a book cover to be subtle, as long as it's brilliantly executed like this. Now to talk about books in my collection in terms of editions. I do have 2 copies with the original text, with the original cover. Apologies for the plastic cover sort of picking up the light, but I have been able to get copies with good condition jackets, so the artwork isn't terribly affected. This one's in nice shape. Of course, it has the more orangish type spine. And then the rear is advertising aviation stories from the Syndicate. Inside, we have the iconic orange Greta end papers. And then the book listing goes up to the secret panel, which would indicate this printing is from about 1946. Then, of course, you slip the jacket off and see the iconic layout and design. But this has the sort of deeper, more tan brown and the different binding type, which of course indicates being a 1940s copy. But even though this copy seems to be from 1946, it's also indicating that it is indeed what's known as the wartime type of Hardy Boys edition. And what that means is they did, of course, switch during the war to a different type of paper, much pulpier, more likely, and a cheaper paper type. So the wartime copies and copies from shortly after World War II would be the same. They all have a tendency to have deep browning, and also the pages can get a little bit brittle, and these are also very prone to getting, smells and odors and dust and dirt and things. But occasionally you get one like this that while the pages are very browned, it has held up quite well. And there is a certain charm sometimes, I think, in looking or reading a Hardy Boys original edition in a wartime era or mid-1940s era copy. Otherwise, it's exactly the same in terms of text and layout and margins as all of the original text. But again, you can very easily tell this is from the World War II era or just afterwards. So this being 1946, it's while they were still making them in the same style. So that's why these are generally referred to all as wartime editions. Of course, they also did away with the front piece artwork, and there's no plugs for any other book series in the back. It's just basically the book and no front artwork, no anything. But this is still in pretty nice shape, I have to admit. And then nicely on the rear, they advertise for the Lone Ranger books that I would love to read all of someday. Now contrast that with my other copy, which of course is also carrying the original artwork. But as you can see, it's definitely got more wear and some tape repairs. We still have the orangish spine, but you can also note that this is quite a bit slimmer than the 1940s edition. That's another thing. They were, while the revision process was to slim down the books, they had already done that over the years. So when you get two copies separated by about a decade, even if they have the same cover art, you'll note that the actual binding and overall design of the book is usually different, and they got slimmer and more cost efficient, essentially. On the inside, we still have the orange Greta end papers, but this copy lists to the Ghost at Skeleton Rock, which would put this at about a 1957 printing. But of course, you don't have the browning of the pages inside, so that's the benefit of obviously getting a later copy. But the front piece was removed long before this, so this doesn't have one. But basically, this is the exact same text and the same layout, but in a 1957 or so edition with no wartime era browning of the pages and a much slimmer, more cost-efficient binding. And then on the back, it's advertising for the Tom Swift Jr. series, and on the rear flap for the Tom Corbett Space Cadet Adventure Stories. Slip out the dust jacket to find the same design with the iconic logo, but now on the similarly iconic 1950s era brown tweed hardcover. My childhood copy of the revised text is this picture cover edition. As you can tell by the addition of the number, this is obviously a much later copy from the 70s. You can also tell by the spine having the updated number font. They started changing the fonts over time. And then the rear has the sort of transitional period rear where we have the older style on the top in terms of the font and layout, but they had already switched to the Helvetica font for the titles. This lists to Mysterious Caravan, so that puts this at about a 1975 printing. Now, in terms of the cover, this is not bad, but as you can see, there's a little bit of color fringing. So whoever did this didn't do the best job at the transferring. So even when I was a kid, I sort of noticed that this cover sometimes, depending on the edition you had, it wasn't reproduced the best. So this looks a little bit soft and has a little bit of color fringing. And then the white of the title especially has some red on it, even the yellow of the revised Hardy Boys logo. So this is just one I always had where I noticed that the cover was a little bit off in the reproduction. The interior boards have the iconic black and white multi-scene end papers. Then here's the revised text title page with the front piece artwork. And of course, the font layout and design of all the revised text. Then to briefly go through all the internal illustrations exclusive to the revised text. This is the one that always stuck with me as a kid because I always thought there would be a red-bearded pirate ghost dressed in black with a slouch hat in a storm outside the window of my house at night. So that's one of those that I never quite forgot. So still to this day, I think of that. It still sticks with me. And this, the boys and Chet Morton find Fenton Hardy knocked out. And the amount of times both the Hardy Boys and their father get knocked unconscious in the series means that they must have skulls of steel because they never get extreme concussions from all the times they get knocked out by being knocked over the head. In this, the boys' peppery Aunt Gertrude gets confronted by a Great Dane who they have to babysit for a while. And this is one of the great humorous moments with Aunt Gertrude, I think, in the series, because, of course, she's at first horrified and then comes to love the dog, who's a bit of a goof and, of course, gigantic. Here's a nice example of a 2-page illustration spread where the boys while sort of clowning around exploring the island, manage to discover a secret system of caves, which of course are tied in to the nefarious activities going on. Here the boys uncover what may be the Golden Pharaoh's head or a striking duplicate copy of the real thing. And then of course the vintage 70s handy order form. And then here's my flashlight edition copy. This of course in the flashlight type design that's all uniform, so you've got the matching spine and the generic rear cover. This has a little bit of wear, but what's interesting about this is that this is a printing from 1994, so it's rather early for the flashlight editions in terms of what you find, and usually the earlier you go, the more solid the printings are. Now, in terms of the coverage, you can see this doesn't have the softness and the sort of color bleeding and fringing of my 1970s copy, but there's also some different color tints sort of creeping in. So it looks good, but I still would like to get a mint condition original copy just to have the cover as best represented as possible. But this is pretty solid for a flashlight edition because they could vary wildly in how well they reproduce the covers. And as time wore on, that got worse and worse by like the mid to late 2000s. And they could also crop the covers quite terribly. So this is well done, but you can also tell this is much earlier in terms of the flashlight editions. Also, I don't know how visible this may be, but there's a little bit of slight browning on this copy, I think because it predates them switching over to completely recycled paper on these. Yes, it does. I just double checked, doesn't have the logo. So this, of course, is the revised text. Also, the actual ink seems a bit bolder. So the actual printing of the ink and the text seems more bold and striking than later flashlight editions. It's rare that I see any of these earlier ones. You can always tell by looking at the print date page there. But yeah, it is rare that I come across a flashlight edition copy I can pick up that's not from, say, 1998 to about 2005. Those are most of the copies you see. So it's very rare that I find one from the early 90s. And this definitely has a sort of, not necessarily thicker, but it does feel a little bit sturdier. So then, of course, you can see the title page and see how the text does indeed seem to be a bit bolder in the printing, and also there's a little bit of browning starting to come in on the actual pages. But also the boards of this are so solid and firm that it does look like somebody or the previous owner did sort of crack through that a little bit on the back. So that seems to be something else they addressed over time, because all the other flashlight copies I've had aren't quite as firm all the way across the actual boards of the book. So I think they made various tweaks over time. So maybe it's probably a better idea to get that sort of sweet spot in terms of flashlight editions and look for copies printed between, say, 1997 or so and 2003, 2004-ish. So those are my overall thoughts on reading both text editions of Book 17, The Secret Warning, in the classic Hardy Boys canon. This is a fascinating comparison to do, and I think there's enough of elements of the original text to call the revised text essentially a remake, but the original text being one of the John Button books automatically makes that stand out, and it's nowhere near as good as the 16 books that preceded it by Leslie MacFarlane. So the original text is very much an acquired taste. It's not terrible, but it also doesn't quite feel like a Hardy Boys book, and it's not as satisfying as it should be. And you can definitely tell it's one that fans usually like to grumble or complain about. But things definitely do get crazier in the next two books, so those videos are going to be even more fun to do, because those books amp up that sort of over the topness even more than this book does. But the revised text definitely is the better book of the two. I don't think it's really a contest, or I don't think it's a fair comparison to make, because the revised text is so incredibly better and properly constructed, where the original text really isn't. Whether that dates back to the outline John Button was given, or that maybe he wasn't the best person to write Hardy Boys books, I'm not sure. But his original texts, I do think, are the sort of low point of the original series of original textbooks. And I think that if any of the original text ever needed to be revised, it's the John Button books. The revised text of Secret Warning, I do think, is significantly better. So again, your results may vary. There is stuff to enjoy in the original text, so I don't want to just completely be bad-mouthing the original John Button text of Secret Warning, but you can definitely tell where it comes up short, especially when you read these books back to back. So again, this is a perfect comparison read to do to understand the goals and the strengths of the revision process, however misguided its application may have been in terms of supplanting the original text for ostensibly the idea was apparently all time. This is, I think, a fascinating comparison to do, whether you're interested in the series or not. I think it's fascinating to do just from a literary and publishing standpoint, or literary history. But The Secret Warning is a prime example where the revised text pretty much wipes the floor with the original, and the original only has the sort of more over-the-top 1930s pulp atmosphere and consistent near over-the-top peril the boys get themselves into, and most notably all the scenes of the boys in the depths in old-fashioned diving equipment almost dying constantly with zero diving training. Those are the most striking elements of the original text that, while there are diving scenes in the revised text, the boys have had diving experience and they're not in old-fashioned equipment. And while there is peril underwater, it's not, on the extreme terrifying level, and also dealing with what lurks in the depths, like the original text does. So that's the one thing the original text has over the revised text, that it's got a greater danger factor, and the underwater sequences are cranked to 11 in terms of intensity, whereas in the revised text there may be more like a 7 or 8 out of 10. So as always, I hope my babblings about the classic Hardy Boys series and book collecting have been at least somewhat fun and informative. This is a wonderful way to re-engage with the series if you're doing a reread and you're looking for some way to make the books feel fresh again. And I think it's important to do to understand the history and development of the series, but also a fascinating way to understand how the books were changed, and how the publishers, how the Stratemeyer Syndicate decided they wanted to try and match the elements of the new times, but also streamline the books and try to get them in line with the way the books were being written at that time in the late 1950s, early 60s. I will be returning to this series in a similar comparison video comparing the two texts of Book 18, The Twisted Claw, so do look out for that hopefully soon. Please do keep supporting your local independent bookstores by hopefully being able to pick up some really nice vintage Hardy Boys editions for your shelf, and also both original and revised text to do your own comparison reads. Keep reading print books, keep enjoying the classic, iconic Hardy Boys series, and as always, thank you ever so much for watching.